Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're talking about the still technically new album from Kaskade, Undo. Right, here's a project from the end of 2025 I didn't have time to cover when it was just coming out, but I knew I wanted to make a video on the moment I saw it was a thing. Ryan Radin, aka Kaskade, is a deep house and mainstream EDM producer and fellow Chicagoan who's been active since the beginning of the 2000s and putting out lots of records, nearly always working in collaboration with Finn Bjarnson as a duo behind the scenes. Though he's probably best known for his work also in collaboration with deadmau5, most notably on the track I Remember, which is still regarded as one of the most iconic EDM tracks of all time, though also more recently in that KX5 project, which is, less iconic. Like deadmau5, he may not exactly be on the forefront of the scene in quite the same way he used to be back in the day, but when I was finishing high school, he was a pretty big deal, and I used to follow him pretty closely and spin his stuff all the time. Guy's a big nostalgia button for me. One could be forgiven for getting the impression that Kaskade mostly kind of fell in deadmau5's shadow. Kaskade, even in his commercial prime, never got the kind of widespread media attention and depth of fandom deadmau5 did, and I Remember looms fairly large above Kaskade's career as a result. Though simply leaving it at that I think really sells Kaskade short, because I'd personally argue if you just look at their catalogs of music as a whole, they were roughly equally as consistent and even had high points equally as high, independent from each other. And while Kaskade definitely tried to play the mainstream pop game more than deadmau5 ever did, to mixed at best results, he did also benefit from not having any of deadmau5's complete asshole disposition, and he never really had any major controversies. At least, not that I personally know of or can recall. If something weird comes out about him, or came out about him that I didn't know about, then I reserve the right to take that back. But at least at the time he had a pretty unproblematic image, and to my knowledge he still does, so that's nice. I've just been able to be nostalgic for his work without having weird conflicting strings attached in the same way that I kinda do for deadmau5. Now, I've talked about Kaskade in passing a couple of times over the course of this channel's life, though the last time I did a full dedicated video on his solo work was a review of his last proper studio album all the way back in 2015 called Automatic, which was one of the very first videos I ever uploaded to this channel at all. The guy has released plenty of stuff since then, including the KX5 project, some EPs and compilations, 2 Christmas albums, and plenty of loose tracks, not even to mention his work as part of the band Late Night Alumni. Though we haven't gotten a traditional full-length solo studio album from him in over a decade. And seeing this new comeback album on the way finally provided me with the perfect excuse to go back and refamiliarize myself with his previous body of work, and allow me to talk about it more in depth. I could stand some updated takes on this guy's work now that I actually have the ability to deliver to camera and articulate my thoughts, which I did not back in 2015. I will be including a couple of album-length projects he put out after Automatic, which technically aren't counted as proper mainline albums, to fill in the gap of his non-hiatus. Although I will be skipping over the Christmas albums, for the simple reason that I have way too much personal disdain for Christmas music on a general level to even have the ability to give them a fair shot. I'm sure the guy cared about making them, given his Mormon upbringing, and I have not heard bad things about them from people who actually bothered to hear them. I'm told they sound exactly how you'd imagine them to sound. But yeah, I can't say I'm actually interested in hearing for myself. But whatever, putting that aside, here's my thoughts on his previous discography so far. Alright, so I think this was the first traditional deep house record I ever heard. If not, it certainly set the tone for what I enjoy in this particular genre. I distinctly remember the existence of this album, low-key being the reason I didn't initially click with Disclosure's Settle around the time that came out, since I thought, hey, we already have this other deep house guy in the EDM scene, why is everyone talking about how unique these guys are? Bit of a reductive comparison there, but whatever. Coming back to re-listen to this album all these years later, I still think it holds up as properly great. Catchy house jams like the title track, I Feel Feel Like or Meditation to the Groove may be what this album is primarily remembered for, and those tracks are all great, but what really made this album go the extra mile for me back in the day was all the jazzier influences showing up on more ambient-ish moments like Seeing Julie or My Time that bring in really nice saxophones. Or just the existence of the entirely instrumental Charlie's Plight, which lets a bunch of really nice flute soloing go over all these spacey downtempo grooves. I wouldn't call it groundbreaking, and I don't enjoy every track here equally, but the whole album is super smooth, and I've gotten loads of replay value out of the whole thing over the years. I think it comes in at an extremely close second place for my favorite album of his overall. More of the same kind of stuff as the last album. If you put it directly side by side with his debut, it's less varied or catchy across the board, and one could theoretically reduce it to just being leftovers that didn't make the cut for that album. But I'd say that's a bit harsh. All of this is still enjoyable for what it is. First of all, there are 2 legit home run tracks here, which are among some of my favorites from him ever. In the opener, Steppin' Out, which has all these crisp inclusions of acoustic guitars adding up to one of his most uplifting and breezy bangers. As well as the slow burn R&B influenced track, Soundtrack to the Soul, which has some absolutely gorgeous string sections. Those 2 always got way more play than everything else, though the rest of the album is still quite solid too. There's a bit more of a focus on the deep house bangers over the downtempo cuts on average. Tracks like Sweet Love and One You have among the better hooks, and I Like the Way has a lot of nice vibraphones, always like that. Though a couple of other downtempo ballads such as Maybe, or I guess the closer Let You Go, still hit a heartfelt note. The latter has some nice trumpet solos too. So yeah, technically the weakest of his early period trilogy, but not by that much at all. It's still definitely worth hearing. Like the last 2 albums, but with more focus specifically on the down-tempo, jazzy, and R&B influenced sides of his sound, with less in the way of hooks, but leaning a bit more into the interesting instrumental textures, I guess. I always used to really come back to the track McCammon the most. I really like the blend of upright bass and piano on that one, but the whole thing is all around very nice and consistent for what it is. Still less good than his debut, but I'd say it's better than In the Moment. By the way, it's not on streaming. Initially, it was only available through a limited, self-released CD run, though he did upload the album to YouTube a few years later, so yeah, you can check it out that way, and it is worth giving a shot. Anyway, the same year that he released The Calm, he also made the jump from his original home label of Ohm Records to one of the biggest mainstream dance music labels, Ultra Records. And this was where he started to see his name pushed in front of a wider audience. I don't remember really caring that much about this album in particular back in the day. I pretty much found it to be like a less memorable retread of other ideas he'd already done without any major standouts, and I almost never actually came back to it. And coming back to it now, well, a less memorable retread is still kind of what it is for me. I still would probably consider it one of his weakest efforts. Though it was better than I remembered. I mean, it has none of his best tracks ever. I think the biggest highlight is probably Be Still for, having the hook that the album title is derived from. And even that is a far cry from the heights that even, the standouts from In the Moment can hit for me. And there are still a solid handful of dull cuts that just bounce off me. But the bass lines and beats are a bit punchier and more energetic on average than his earlier stuff, and most of the melodic hooks are pretty solid and tight across the board. I won't call it a must listen, but it's all serviceable enough at worst. But the first album to really blow him up to a wider audience had to be this one. At its core, it's an across-the-board improved version of Love Mysterious with better hooks and even cleaner and flashier production, though it's mainly remembered because it has the track I Remember on it. It's basically I Remember the album, and not the actual I Remember the album that he put out afterwards. That's like a greatest hits thing. Now, a big part of how I Remember stuck around in everyone's consciousness as much as it did was because of how it stuck out like such a sore thumb in the context of the Deadmau5 album, Random Album Title, being that album's big centerpiece and the only track on an otherwise minimal progressive house album to feature vocals. Though this album obviously does a lot more to illustrate exactly how important Kaskade's input was to that track, and demonstrated how it equally melded both artists' talents. I Remember may still be the obvious best track here, but it feels a lot more at home on this album next to all these other cuts that sound similar to it. And the other tracks aren't just boneless copies of the big hit either. The other Deadmau5 collab, Move For Me, is widely regarded in the same classic tier as I Remember, and Angel on My Shoulder comes in a close third place. Though all 10 tracks here are good, and the down-tempo ballady moments like Pose or Your Love Is Black provide some welcome variety to the experience while fitting perfectly alongside the big hits. All around very good album. I would say it is one of his better efforts overall. Oh Jesus, this one. So coming off the success of the Deadmau5 crossovers, this album shows him leaning even further into the mainstream EDM scene at the time, flirting with a lot more aggressive electro-influenced styles. I did recently go through my thoughts on this album when I did a video as part of this channel's 10-year anniversary on tracks that overshadow the rest of their albums. But yeah, holy shit, is Dynasty still such a weird once-in-a-lifetime case of not only featuring my easy favorite track Kaskade ever made in his entire career, Don't Stop Dancing, which is basically an even better version of I Remember about how your life is always worth living even when you don't think it will be anymore, that has legit pulled me from an emotional brink in the past. But also featuring my easy least favorite track Kaskade ever made in his entire career, Fire in Your New Shoes. Following the same kind of fake punk club boom sound as Tiesto's Kaleidoscope, complete with god-awful mixing, ugly synth organs that drown out everything, and even lyrics about celebrating commercialism and talking about how cool you are because you paid a lot of money on fashionable new shoes. Among the biggest sellout commercial soundtrack-ready garbage I've ever heard, and it, legit makes me viscerally angry whenever I try to, actively pay attention to it. Dynasty has to be the only album I've ever heard or will ever hear in my life to feature both a track I consider a 10 out of 10 and a track I consider a 1 out of 10. That is the kind of insane duality that could have only been possible in the early 2010s mainstream EDM scene. The rest of this album, ignoring those two tracks, is alright. There are other tracks I like. Don't Wait was also a longer-term keeper. The guitars and disco strings on that one make it feel like one of his early, in-the-moment era cuts. And coming back to hear the rest of the album for the first time in years, I also like the track Say It's Over, I guess To the Skies was nice, and I surprisingly thought the actual Tiesto collab Here Only You was one of the better cuts. It helps that Kaskade just stuck to the progressive house sound of his previous album for that one, and it helps that Tiesto is not a real person and thereby cannot distract from his style. There's also other tracks I don't care for. Human Reactor sounds like ass, and Call Out is a boring nothing burger. Everything else is fine. I don't really have strong feelings on. All of this adds up to an album that, all my various all-over-the-place feelings near perfectly cancel out to, straight down the middle of the road, low 6, high 5 range, I guess. So yeah, that's an album that is impossible to sum up quickly, but I guess averages out to, it's alright. Anyway, Dynasty was still a success, so he doubled down on the mainstream EDM direction, even further embracing the popular electro house sound of the time, and gaining even further success in the process to the point where this album got him his first Grammy nomination. All signs point towards a sellout disaster, but thankfully, I feel like the results turned out to be way more consistently enjoyable than Dynasty. I would get it if this fell flat for people, especially the further alienated fans of his original, early Ohm record sound. But as far as this brand of mainstream EDM and electro house goes, it's all quite solid for what it is. I remembered pretty much all the tunes to every track, from their frequent popping into my head at random times, despite my not having listened to the album in full in years. The attempt at rock crossovers even go over significantly better. Lessons in Love, and to a lesser extent the track Ice, are like a peek into an alternate universe of what if the Tiesto Kaleidoscope sound actually worked well and was fun to listen to. There's also a great Skrillex crossover with some funkier twists called Lick It, even one jazzier track called Waste Love that would have hit at home on his debut. And of course, we can't forget the fact that this is technically a double album. Really, two versions of the same album packaged together. The first disc of Fire has the standard EDM editions of all these tracks, but the second disc of Ice shows Kaskade reimagining every single track on the first disc in a more down-tempo style. Some of which are just completely transformed, like how Lick It turns into like an IDM-influenced cut, taking direct cues from Boards of Canada's Turquoise Hexagon Sun, or how Lessons in Love turns into a grooving deep house instrumental with a completely new lead melody that somehow equally is catchy. Those are the best two Ice mixes by far, but the rest are also all pretty interesting spins on the original tracks that feel more than distinct enough from their source material to justify their existence, and even somehow be beneficial to hear both versions of the album back to back. Yeah, there was already a fair bit of nostalgia bias working in this album's favor. I was listening to this one all the time when I was in high school, but all of it still totally holds up for me. Maybe even better than I remembered. I think it might just barely scrape into great territory. I have not bothered to hear the V3 re-recordings he did in 2022. I'm not entirely sure why those needed to exist, but whatever. But that takes us to what I think is probably his best album overall. Certainly the one I would most highly recommend to someone looking to get into Kaskade for the first time, combining everything that worked about all his previous eras at once. Big, flashy EDM bangers with catchy hooks like Last Chance and Feeling the Night, sharing space next to emotional piano and ambient ballads like No One Knows Who We Are or Floating, as well as chill deep house with jazzy touches like Take Your Mind Off and How It Is, and I think Missing You as well. Tracks like those are definitely some of my favorites. In between all of those, we have Kaskade's first stab at taking the lead vocals himself on the title track, which goes over quite well. But the real biggest highlights are a set of 3 low-key instrumental house cuts, all named after airport codes, which are produced by Ryan Radin alone without any behind-the-scenes collaborators. And those are some of the first tracks that come to mind when I think about Kaskade in passing. If I'm ever in the mood to just, listen to this guy's music, this is the most likely project I'm going to pull out. Also on most recent revisit, some of the tracks that previously used to be skips for me, like Why Ask Why and Something Something, did start to click more with me, so yeah, I would put this among my all-time favorite 2010s mainstream EDM records. And that leaves what would be his last solo studio album for a decade, itself marking a move on to another new label, his ascension to the actual major label Warner Brothers Records, and his own new imprint called Arcade. And this is his most overt play for mainstream radio yet. It's fine, I guess. I was pretty positive towards it back when I reviewed it a decade ago, and I did have it in pretty regular rotation back in the day since I had become a pretty in-depth fan at the time who was even closely following the rollout and singles and stuff. Though there might have been a tiny bit of cope in that old video. At best, it was definitely another case of, certain tracks hitting better than others, and it definitely sounds like the kind of thing that had, major label executives calling the shots and steering his final direction. I still like the piano-heavy house tracks like Phoenix and Day Trippin', even if the latter is still dangerously close to California Girls by Katy Perry in one bits. They do share a songwriter. Piano house was still kind of a rare occurrence in 2015, even if it doesn't stand out as much by today's standards. And I do still like some of the big singles like Never Sleep Alone and A Little More as well. The really big hit Disarm You is fine as well. And he does make sure to keep enough of his deep house roots in many of the deep cuts like Tear Down These Walls, Promise, Breaking Up, etc. to prevent it from feeling like as big a sellout as it could have been. But also the very beginning stretch with tracks like Us and Mercy is pretty rough. And just in general, this album has a particularly generic radio pop feel running through everything, even on the best parts. It could have turned out a lot worse than it did. I still probably like it more than Dynasty or Love Mysterious, but it does not come near the heights of either of his previous 2 albums, and in retrospect, it's not one of his better efforts overall. Anyway, Automatic may have been his last solo studio album for over a decade, and the last time I was closely keeping up with his work, but he did still remain active in all that time since, One way he remained active was through the Redux series of EPs he regularly put out from 2014 onwards. I'm obviously skipping over most of those, but I wanted to mention the third installment in this series in particular because that one is an EP in name only and has 18 tracks. The only installment in the series to stretch out to proper album length. I'd actually meant to cover it around the time it came out in 2019, although I got busy with other stuff and it fell through the cracks. Also, this came directly out of the era that he released a single featuring Meghan Trainor, of all people. So between that and the fact that he didn't have the heart to actually call it a traditional album, I may have felt like it might not be the best use of my spare time back then. Although the Meghan Trainor track thankfully does not appear on this project. Anyway, listening to this for the first time now, it's not the worst thing I've ever heard or anything, but it is pretty dang weak and phoned in feeling. If I had to count this as an album, it would be his weakest. He does stick to fairly traditional deep house formulas in his comfort zone, and none of these tracks are like an active turnoff. Besides, maybe that one track which builds itself around an on-the-nose sample of fucking Tom's Diner by Suzanne Vega. God, that track is so freaking overused as a sample. But all the instrumentals are so much more bare bones and lifeless, and everything absolutely has to have a radio-friendly pop hook, either through vocal guest or Fred Again style low-energy vocal sample. Yet none of the hooks have the stickiness that his older work did. It still has its moments. I like the tracks Loose, Tight, Dancin', and Fun. All of those grooves are pretty tight. Love Me Like You Used To and the closer Lay Down have some nice string inclusions. The latter cut's full orchestral arrangement makes it the best cut here by a long shot, and a nearly undeservedly strong emotional finish, but everything else I could take or leave. I mean, as a whole, it's listenable, but very inessential. Ironically, there's at best really only about an EP's worth of good material here, and even that isn't so mind-blowing where I say you'd need to go out of your way for it. There's also this project he put out during the pandemic, which I had no idea even existed at the time it actually came out. Technically marked as a compilation since it's part of a series of DJ mix projects which were otherwise named after locations he'd been to, like Iceland and stuff. But this is an album-length project entirely made out of original material, aside from 2 remixes of non-Kaskade tracks, so I decided to include it here anyway. In practice, this is kinda like a spiritual sequel to what he did with The Calm nearly 15 years prior, entirely focusing on the down-tempo side to his sound and making like a lo-fi beats to study to type record, with some jazz and R&B influenced flavors. It is nothing revolutionary or attention-grabbing, but if you just want some chill background music-y stuff, it's actually all very solid for what it is, and refreshingly contains none of the overtly commercial radio pop overtones that got in the way of his other stuff in this era. Quite handily the most enjoyable thing he put out post-Atmosphere, and actually worth giving a shot if you're into this style, so yeah, pleasantly surprised by this. Oh yeah, I guess you could count that as an album too. I already did a full video on this one, so if you want full thoughts you can check that out, but yeah, I stand by my previously expressed feelings of it being perfectly fine but completely inessential, and none of it comes near the best work of either Kaskade or Deadmau5, and kinda paints both artists as being very much past their prime. The track Escape is good, there's nothing else you need to go out of your way for. So, that finally brings us to here. That ran really long, sorry. I kind of wanted to get that out of my system since I have a feeling like a proper discography review on this guy would not really be performing well, but yeah. And that did actually bring back a lot of good memories. I mean, I was half afraid that this mini-marathon was going to, like, expose Kaskade as being a poorly aged product of a different time, but for the most part, I ended up retaining the same feelings on his catalog that I used to have back when I was a teenager, and the majority of his stuff still held up for me. So anyway, that takes us to this brand new comeback album he released this past December. I did know about its existence before the year went out and initially wanted this video to come out between the last Some Stuff I Missed roundup of the year and the year-end list. Though then it turned out December was surprisingly stacked and I had to let this video slip into 2026 instead. Given the trajectory of Kaskade's career over the past decade, I kinda had a feeling in the back of my mind that this project probably was not going to be anything mind-blowing and that it was safe to push my thoughts into the next year. Obviously, I was a lot more excited to do that in brief segment than I was to, like, actually hear what he was going to do for a new album at the end of 2025 all these years later. But I jumped into it anyway, assuming I was probably going to get some pretty solid house album that I was going to enjoy, but probably not be the kind of thing that I would find that memorable. I didn't really hear any buzz about it one way or the other beforehand. I suppose if there's anything interesting to note, for one thing, he moved to a new label again, releasing on Monster Cat this time. I also saw his Instagram post he made, like, kind of vaguely talking about his creative process, like, talking about how this album had broken a long string of him having writer's block out of the music he was making feeling insincere and forced to him, and only in embracing his real, in-the-moment feelings, even in the middle of a not-so-great period of his life, did he come up with something he felt happy with. Which sounds like a nothing description, but, to be fair, that period of personal struggle he mentioned did also include him going through a divorce, with his wife who had previously been married to him for nearly 30 years, so that wasn't necessarily all meaningless PR fluff. So yeah, anyway, after listening to Undo and sitting with it for a bit, while it was more or less the kind of album that I expected it to be, honestly, it went over about as reasonably well as I could have hoped for it to go. It's certainly much better than anything on the KX5 project. Actually, I feel like there's an interesting parallel to make between this and his last real album, Automatic. That album had a lot of his catchiest pop hooks and his most memorable tunes, but also felt like it kinda lacked deeper substance in a way that felt specifically well-tuned to, like, record executives' ideas of what would make a good hit record or something. This album is kind of the reverse of that. In terms of the melodic hooks, it's actually one of his weakest, with few of these tracks having the ability to really stick in my head. But I can sense that Kaskade did put more of his heart into this material and get it to hit more on those emotional levels. I can believe him when he talks about the more personal focus of this thing, even if the idea of a more personal album is, again, typically a pretty meaningless descriptor. Interestingly, a small part of what adds to that more personal focus is the lyrics. Ordinarily, given the space that Kaskade operates in, I wouldn't even be giving the lyrics a second thought. I mean, this is commercial house music, not exactly a genre known for deep writing. And the writing on this album also is not exactly so deep as to be, like, you know, worth analyzing that in depth either. But a lot of it is clearly breakup themed, which I suppose reflects his real life situation. A lot of tracks about a relationship gone wrong and wondering how it could have gone better, like on Starting Over, or If Only, or I Can't Make You Love Me. There's very loose attempts to show both sides of the situation, with tracks from the perspective of the woman in the relationship, who wants to move on and doesn't want to look back, like on Unspoken, or perhaps being a little more bitter and toxic in tone on Fools, or especially Where's My Wedge, which is definitely about two rich people going through a divorce, right down to mentioning all the expensive stuff around them. That gets a little uncomfortable, even if otherwise that track is one of the marginally more instrumentally textured bangers on display here. If these tracks are all supposed to be about the same relationship falling apart, there is also a bit of a slant towards painting the guy in the relationship as having been the one that screwed up. The songs with male singers have more of a regretful and pleading and confused tone than the songs with female singers, which have more of a tone of kind of being done with this shit on average. Mind you, the album's not exactly trying to tell any story, nor is every track on here even about breakups. There's also tracks such as Like That, or Deeper, or Dancer, that seem to be, like, more positively about love, without any particular drama. I don't think this album is designed to be, like, directly autobiographical or paint Kaskade's real perspective on his personal life. Being about breakups is kind of like a more of a loose, overarching theme in the background. But, you know, it is something that's clearly there and did have at least some thought put into it. It's an aspect of the album that would be difficult to ignore entirely, and I don't think he fumbled the topic or made it come off like he was trying to do damage control or something. If there is any mirror to his personal life, it would all be entirely in the abstract, and even as just kind of like a sad vibe, or like maybe there's some confused feelings, but I feel like he's trying to make it so that you wouldn't be able to blame either side for feeling the way they do, I guess. Now, the lyrics having any particular meaning is pretty much just a bonus when it comes to this kind of album. The more important thing is how it sounds and how good the tunes are. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't really an album designed to have catchy hooks that stick in your mind. I think the track Dancer, the lead single, is the only one with a tune that I'm more likely to remember longer term, and even that isn't like one of his top tier hooks either. Although across the album, the house grooves are all still pretty solid and danceable, the chord progressions do consistently carry a bit more emotional weight, bit of a moody minor key slant to things on average, and there is a solid amount of variety in terms of the instrumental textures too. There's a lot of really nice piano textures running through tracks like Imprint and Touch, which get particularly atmospheric and dreamlike. Unspoken is mostly just a regular piano ballad in the same vein as No One Knows Who We Are from Atmosphere, and that's nice. But there's also tracks which feel like they're built around older soul samples, like I Can't Make You Love Me and Fools, that hit kind of a similar note to artists like LPGOB or certain more recent Odessa productions. Those are some of the bigger bangers, and I also have to give a particular shout out to the track Obvious for having the most powerful and propulsive drop of any track on this album. Actually had me turning my head like, oh, that actually went pretty hard. And there's some other genre twists here and there. I guess tracks like Deeper and If Only are kind of more guitar-driven ballads, which I don't really have strong feelings on. But beyond that, the track Like That shows Kaskade's attempt at doing like a drum and bass influence thing, which did grab me a fair bit more. And there's also some tracks which even bring in some orchestral elements as well, most notably on Starting Over, that also combines some more cinematic strings with some mildly burial-influenced garage beats. But especially the album closer, Can I Surrender, that makes for quite the dramatic finish to this whole thing in spite of initially building itself out of like minimal lo-fi hip-hop influence beats like on that Arcade Destination's Living Room thing. The vocal processing on that one is layered on a bit thickly and compresses Finn Bjarnsson's voice into oblivion, though the strings swelling around him more than make up for it and hit kind of like a Röyksopp adjacent note for me. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I have to note on Undo. I can't imagine this album's going to be a long-term keeper for me. It's almost the exact level of quality I went in expecting it to be, i.e. merely pretty good and not great, and the lack of strong hooks combined with the obvious lack of nostalgia bias that much of his older stuff has doesn't exactly work to its benefit. I would be surprised if anyone came out of this hearing like their new favorite Kaskade album ever, but I do find all of it to be respectable for what it's going for, and he did clearly have his heart put into this material. For the people who felt like he lost the plot over the past several years, this might end up feeling like he's getting back on the right track. It's neither the best nor the worst work that Kaskade has put out over his career. I want to say it's better than Automatic and less good than, I don't know, In the Moment. Kinda like lower middle tier for him, I guess. I won't call it an absolute must listen, but I did all around enjoy my time with it, and I found it to be a respectable return to form for him in comparison with much of the material he's released over the past decade or so, so yeah, I guess you can take that all as you will. It's pretty good. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.